breaking news from Buckingham Palace, which has announced that the King has been diagnosed with cancer.
There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles' cancer is incurable, and he will likely die with the disease. What you're about to hear didn't come from a palace statement, but from the faces of Prince William and Princess Anne, the moment they realized the truth could no longer be hidden. So if this story moves you, make sure you subscribe to Royal Storyline UK, turn on the notification bell, drop a like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and let me know whether you think the monarchy will ever be the same after this. The words hang in the air like something no one wants to touch. Not a distant spokesman, not some carefully worded palace notice slipped out after dark. This came from Prince William and Princess Anne standing together under the weight of what they had just learned. Their faces gave it away before either of them spoke a single syllable. King Charles had suffered a serious deterioration in his health. His public duties had been suspended, and the monarchy was suddenly staring at the very possibility it had spent months trying to keep at arm's length. William gripped the lectern as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. He confirmed that his father had endured an overnight medical crisis, the kind that arrives without warning and leaves everyone scrambling. A sharp decline followed, one that now required constant specialist supervision. The prince paused. You could almost hear him choosing each word with care, knowing that every sentence would travel further than the walls of that room. Public engagements, private audiences, ceremonial duties, and even the non-essential constitutional meetings had all been suspended. A private audience is a closed meeting between the sovereign and an invited official. A constitutional meeting involves formal duties tied to government. Those cancellations mattered more than most people realized, because Charles had built his entire reign around visible service. Every empty space in his calendar raised one brutal, unspoken question: who would stand in his place? Anne did not move. She did not speak, yet her face revealed the cost of that famous royal control. The Princess Royal had spent decades defending her older brother through conflict and criticism. Now she stood beside his son, knowing the man she had always treated as indestructible might never return to the life he knew. William felt that same terror, only his burden was crueler. He was speaking as a frightened child while the world studied him as the future king. Then his voice changed. According to the recorded palace statement, the king's condition had become more serious than the family had hoped. William set his notes down as though the sentence itself had become too heavy to hold. He glanced sideways just once, then faced forward again. Neither of them explained that senior family members had been summoned in the middle of the night. The timing alone exposed how quickly the crisis had deepened, and why the announcement could no longer be delayed. William quietly confirmed that constitutional contingency plans had been reviewed. These were emergency arrangements designed to keep essential royal duties functioning if the sovereign became unable to perform them. He refused to reveal how far those preparations had advanced. That silence landed harder than any official phrase. As the statement ended, Anne touched her nephew's arm before they turned away. The gesture lasted only a second, but it carried a promise. Behind those carefully chosen words stood three people facing three different fears. The suffering sovereign, the son being pulled toward the throne faster than he was ready, and the sister determined never to let either man face the darkness alone. Long before the cameras captured their strained expressions, William and Anne had entered a private battle that no title could soften. One was watching his father weaken, while the crown moved closer with terrifying speed. The other was watching her brother confront his mortality behind guarded doors. Between them stood Charles, determined to remain useful even as his body demanded that he surrender control. Charles reached toward the table and asked for the next red box, but William placed one hand firmly on its lid. A red box is a secure case containing government papers that the sovereign must review as part of official duties. Those papers represented more than work to the king. They were proof that he still mattered, that his reign still moved through his hands, and that illness had not yet reduced him to a silent figure waiting for others to decide his future. William closed the box. He told his father that no document was more important than following the doctor's instructions. Charles stared at him with sudden anger, but the anger faded almost as quickly as it appeared. He admitted that stepping away felt like abandoning the duty he had waited most of his life to perform. The confession struck the prince hard. Protecting his father now required him to assume responsibilities that looked dangerously like the first steps toward replacing him. Anne moved closer before the silence could harden. She reminded her brother that accepting care was not surrender, and that protecting the monarchy also meant protecting the man wearing the crown. Charles heard the compassion in her voice, yet he also sensed the fear beneath it. She had defended him through family conflict, public criticism, and decades of uncertainty. Now the Princess Royal feared that his pride might turn necessary rest into a personal defeat. Camilla stood near the closed door, shaken by how quickly the crisis had deepened. She asked whether doctors had withheld the complete medical picture to prevent panic inside the family. The Queen Consort received no clear answer, and that silence disturbed her more than any formal statement. Charles noticed her expression and reached toward her, but even that small movement seemed to cost him strength. Catherine found William later, still studying revised schedules long after everyone else had left. She recognized the habit immediately. The Princess of Wales knew he hid fear by becoming useful, and she warned that duty could not protect him from grief forever. William insisted he was preparing only for the next few days, but she saw the truth. He was already preparing for a world in which his father could no longer lead. Anne suddenly remembered the ceremony when Charles first reached for a chair and whispered that the room was spinning. At the time, the family had called it exhaustion. Now she understood it as the warning they had refused to name. To grasp why the announcement carried such devastating force, they would have to return to that moment, the brief stumble that became the point of no return. The crisis did not begin with the overnight summons. Its true beginning came days earlier during a private investiture meant to prove that strength and continuity still held. Charles entered determined to complete every duty placed before him. Yet halfway through the ceremony, his hand tightened around a chair. His words faltered, and Anne saw something in her brother's face that turned concern into fear. Charles had already accepted a reduced schedule, but even that lighter program remained demanding. The king believed each carefully controlled appearance reassured the country and protected the monarchy from whispers of weakness. An investiture is a formal ceremony in which the sovereign presents honors to people recognized for public service or achievement. Canceling it would have disappointed recipients who had waited years for that moment. And he feared another absence would make illness appear stronger than the crown. Charles began reading the next citation, then suddenly lost his place. He looked down, tried again, and reached for the chair beside him. Anne moved before the nearest aide understood what was happening. She caught her brother by the elbow as he whispered that the room had started spinning. The Princess Royal ordered everyone outside, but he resisted through clenched teeth, insisting the ceremony must continue. Anne refused. She guided him into the chair and told the aides to clear the room immediately. Charles stared at her with anger sharpened by humiliation. The sovereign had spent his reign presenting service as discipline, so losing control in front of others felt like a public defeat. He accused those around him of treating him like a patient instead of a monarch. She answered that no title could command a failing body into silence. Charles confronted his sister again after the medical team arrived. According to a documented account prepared for senior palace officials, Anne told him that stubbornness was no longer courage when it could turn a warning into a national emergency. The king rejected the accusation, yet his hand still trembled. She saw the fear he refused to name, and he saw the pity he could not bear to receive. Doctors completed urgent examinations and found a troubling change that required constant monitoring. Charles listened, then asked that William not be summoned until they were certain. He claimed he wanted to protect his son from unnecessary alarm, but Anne warned that delaying the truth would create a deeper wound. The monarch held firm. William later discovered that precious hours had passed while the palace tried to contain the crisis. His grief hardened into anger, not toward the doctors, but toward the father who had chosen silence over trust. That anger would soon erupt behind a closed door, where two future kings finally faced each other as a frightened son and a dying father. For years, Charles and William had survived disagreement through restraint. They measured words, concealed wounds, and allowed duty to end arguments that love could not resolve. But the health crisis shattered that discipline. With no aides present and no cameras nearby, William demanded to know why he had been kept outside the truth. Charles answered with the pride of a king and the fear of a father who knew what the truth would force his son to become. William closed the study door and placed the canceled engagement schedule on the desk. He had learned about the severity of the crisis only after doctors had called for urgent
official
monitoring
royal biographies,
and constitutional
and
planning
whose name
had
appears
already
in the
begun.
documents.
Constitutional planning means preparing lawful ways for royal duties to continue if the sovereign becomes unable to perform them. That delay mattered because the prince was not only the heir. He was a son who had been denied the chance to stand beside his father before fear turned into emergency. William looked directly at him. "How ill did you intend to become before you trusted me with the truth?" Charles rose at once, anger pushing him forward, but his strength failed before his words did. The king gripped the desk, became unsteady, and lowered himself into the chair. The silence that followed struck harder than the accusation. Both men understood what had just happened, and neither could pretend otherwise. Charles insisted that he had been protecting his son from uncertain information and from premature discussion about succession. William rejected the explanation. He accused his father of confusing control with protection and said the secrecy had forced him to enter the crisis as an heir instead of family. The prince's voice cracked only once, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. Charles finally admitted the truth through a recorded private conversation later preserved in the palace's internal account. He could not bear to watch William's face change from concern to readiness. That expression, he said, would confirm that his son was preparing for a world without him. The king had feared that look more than illness itself. William stepped back, stunned by the confession, but Charles opened a drawer and removed preliminary contingency papers. They allowed the heir and selected counselors of state, senior royals legally permitted to perform limited duties for the monarch, to assume greater responsibility if his condition worsened. The documents proved that the king had prepared for the very future he refused to discuss. Anne entered after hearing the raised voices. She told both men that the medical team now required an immediate decision about how much authority Charles could safely retain. William picked up the papers, but no reconciliation followed. The family's pain had become a struggle over power, and whoever controlled those documents might control the monarchy's next chapter. Power inside a monarchy rarely changes hands with one dramatic command. It moves quietly through canceled meetings, redirected papers, altered briefings, and signatures placed where another hand once ruled. As Charles remained under medical care, William approached a room filled with constitutional advisors waiting for him to act. Yet the most powerful person present was still the absent king, whose wishes shaped every decision. William stopped outside the meeting room and removed his glasses. He pressed his fingers against his eyes, fighting the exhaustion he had hidden since the crisis began. Catherine stood beside him and reminded the prince that leadership did not require emotional numbness. Her words mattered because he was being asked to reassure the country while privately fearing for his father, and because every duty he accepted could look like another step toward the throne. William entered and immediately refused the chair normally used by Charles. He chose the seat beside it instead. The gesture was small, but everyone understood it. A constitutional meeting is a formal discussion about how royal responsibilities can continue within the law when illness prevents the sovereign from performing certain duties. The monarch's authority remained intact, yet practical work had to move somewhere, and that movement carried dangerous meaning. Anne supported expanding her nephew's role, but her voice sharpened when advisors began speaking too easily about permanence. She warned them not to turn medical necessity into an unofficial accession, meaning a transfer of power that looks like the start of a new reign without being formally declared. The Princess Royal wanted William prepared, but she would not allow ambition, panic, or convenience to erase her brother before his time. Camilla listened as schedules, briefings, and public appearances shifted toward the heir. She felt excluded from decisions that now shaped her husband's days. The Queen Consort feared that illness was stripping away not only Charles's authority, but also her ability to protect his personal wishes. Anne noticed her silence and assured her that temporary arrangements would not become permanent without resistance. William opened a sealed instruction signed by the king. The document authorized him to lead key state briefings, approve revised schedules, and represent the crown during treatment. It also named Anne as the person responsible for ensuring every decision remained faithful to Charles's intentions. Her influence was now enormous, and the room grew still as that truth settled. William faced his first decision immediately. He canceled a major royal appearance his father had personally insisted must proceed. The signature preserved the institution, but the cancellation exposed its emotional cost. Charles would not experience it as protection. He would see it as proof that the world had begun moving without him. The fallout began not with public panic, but with a single revised page placed beside the king's bed. An engagement he had prepared for over many months had been removed. William would attend in his place. Charles read the change twice, set the paper down, and stared toward the closed door. In that silence, he understood that illness had achieved what opposition never could. It had forced him to surrender the rhythm of his reign. Charles picked up a pen and circled the canceled National Remembrance Ceremony. The event honored those lost in service, and his absence mattered because the sovereign's presence carried personal and national meaning. Doctors had ruled that the journey, prolonged standing, and public pressure created an unacceptable risk. The king still asked why no one had consulted him before removing his own name. Camilla watched anger collapse into grief. She sat beside her husband as he admitted that he no longer knew whether people were obeying him or protecting him from himself. The Queen Consort reminded him that the decision had been made to keep him alive, but her reassurance could not erase the humiliation. Charles had spent years waiting to serve, and now the machinery of service was learning to move without him. William refused to reverse the cancellation. The prince knew his decision had wounded his father and strengthened whispers that the heir was taking control too quickly. Yet the medical warning left no room for compromise. Upcoming engagements were redistributed, with Anne covering ceremonial duties while other working royals absorbed regional visits. That restructuring mattered because every replacement protected continuity. But every replacement also made the king's absence more visible. Anne confronted Camilla after learning she had encouraged Charles to consider one final public appearance. The Princess Royal understood the impulse, but she warned that hope could become pressure when a sick man believed love required him to prove his strength. Camilla defended herself, saying she had only wanted to give her husband something to fight toward. Neither woman raised her voice, but both understood the stakes. Doctors later delivered a private warning through a recorded medical briefing prepared for the family. Even a minor setback could permanently end Charles's ability to maintain a regular schedule. Catherine then found William reviewing accession-era briefing material late at night. An accession briefing explains the duties and decisions required when a new monarch takes the throne. He claimed the papers were precautionary, but she saw fear behind every page. Charles finally asked Anne to remain after everyone else left. As the palace reorganized itself around his absence, he turned to the sister who had known him before duty hardened his voice, and what he told her would change the family's understanding of the crisis. When the room finally emptied, Charles no longer looked like a monarch defending his authority. He looked like an exhausted brother asking the only person he fully trusted to tell him the truth. Anne sat opposite him without papers, advisors, or ceremonial distance. For several moments, neither spoke. Then the king asked whether stepping back would make him a failure. Her answer transformed the crisis from a struggle against surrender into an act of love. Anne had stood beside her brother through family scandal, public criticism, and the long wait for the throne. That history mattered because she could challenge him without making him feel betrayed, and because Charles knew she understood the cost of duty better than almost anyone. The Princess Royal had spent years protecting the institution, but now she was trying to protect the man trapped inside it. Charles admitted that illness frightened him less than history. He feared his reign would be remembered as unfinished, his withdrawal as weakness, and his son's rise as proof that he had become unnecessary. The king then asked Anne to promise that William would not be pushed into becoming another version of him simply to satisfy the machinery of the crown. That machinery meant the network of advisors, traditions, and constitutional duties that keeps the monarchy functioning even when the family behind it is suffering. Anne moved her chair closer and took her brother's hand. She told him the bravest command he could now give was permission for the family to carry what he could no longer carry alone. Charles looked away, then confessed that he had resented William's decisiveness. Every firm choice proved the prince could lead without him, and that truth cut deeper than any medical warning. Anne did not soften her reply. She admitted she had been angry too. Not because Charles became ill, but because his secrecy stole precious time from everyone who loved him. The Princess Royal told him that protection without trust becomes isolation, and isolation had nearly turned fear into bitterness. Charles finally asked her to deliver a private message to William. According to a recorded family account preserved for senior aides, the king acknowledged that canceling the remembrance ceremony had been the right decision. He also agreed to withdraw indefinitely from major public duties, ending the argument over a rapid return. Anne squeezed his hand before standing. The private promise had settled the family's deepest conflict, but the monarchy still faced millions waiting for reassurance. William would soon address the nation again, this time carrying words written by his father. By morning, the health crisis no longer belonged only to the royal family. It filled television screens, dominated newspaper stands, and drew silent crowds toward the gates of Buckingham Palace. Some came carrying flowers. Others came simply to stand beneath the royal standard and wait. Across the country, one question moved from broadcaster to broadcaster. Could the monarchy remain stable while its sovereign disappeared from public life? Palace officials released a formal bulletin confirming Charles's indefinite withdrawal from major duties. The notice stressed that the king remained sovereign, while William assumed a larger public and constitutional workload. A formal bulletin is an official palace statement used to communicate serious developments with clarity and authority. That distinction mattered because the country needed reassurance that illness had changed the working structure of the monarchy without creating a constitutional vacuum. News organizations interrupted regular programming within minutes. Political leaders expressed support for the monarch and confidence in the arrangements surrounding his treatment. One major newspaper carried a black and white image of William and Anne beneath the headline, "The crown holds its breath." The words captured the moment perfectly. The institution remained standing, but the nation could feel the fear inside it. Hundreds gathered outside Buckingham Palace as the mourning continued. A young girl placed a handwritten card beside the gates reading, "Thank you for trying, Your Majesty." Several adults nearby wiped away tears. The message was simple, but it stripped away ceremony and spoke directly to Charles as a man who had continued serving while his strength was failing. William watched the crowd footage privately before his televised statement. The prince became emotional when he saw people applauding not a victory, but his father's years of service. Anne remained nearby and reminded him that public affection could carry a family through moments official language could not soften. Camilla felt comforted by the sympathy, yet wounded by commentators openly discussing William's readiness to reign, while Charles was still receiving treatment. The queen consort understood why the subject had emerged, but hearing her husband described in the past tense made every expression of support feel edged with loss. William finally faced the nation and read from a message written by the king. According to the recorded broadcast, Charles thanked the public and admitted that service sometimes means accepting the strength of others. Anne's expression softened when the prince delivered one final line: "Support my son with the same patience you granted me." The public had been reassured and the family stood united. Only one judgment remained: whether the crisis had diminished Charles or revealed the greatest act of his reign. The answer would come from the moment one father finally trusted his children to carry the crown forward. The tragic update changed the monarchy, but it did not destroy it. Charles's illness forced every hidden fear into the open. William's terror of replacing his father, Anne's grief for her brother, Camilla's fear of losing the life they had built, and the king's belief that stepping back meant failure. Yet when the confrontation ended and the silence settled, the family discovered that surrendering control was not the same as surrendering purpose. Charles remained sovereign, but his indefinite withdrawal created a new working reality. William became the monarchy's primary public leader, while Anne protected continuity behind closed doors. Constitutional arrangements are lawful measures that allow royal duties to continue when illness limits the monarch's ability to act. Those measures mattered because they prevented uncertainty from becoming crisis, and because they showed the country that the crown could adapt without humiliating the man who still wore it. William visited his father after the televised address and placed the written message back into his hands. The prince told him the country had heard the king, not a replacement. Charles studied the pages, then looked at his son with visible relief. He said he was proud of the way William had protected both the crown and the man beneath it. For the first time since the crisis began, neither spoke as sovereign or heir. They spoke as father and son. William finally released the guilt he had carried through every canceled duty and redirected briefing. Accepting responsibility did not mean he wished for the throne. Protecting the institution did not mean abandoning Charles. The future king understood that love could sometimes look like resistance, and that refusing his father's demands had been an act of loyalty rather than ambition. Anne watched the two men reach the understanding she had fought to protect. The Princess Royal left the room knowing Charles had not been pushed aside, and William had not been forced to face the transition alone. Camilla remained beside her husband, no longer fighting the new reality, but learning how to preserve their life within it. The crisis delivered its final revelation. The monarchy's survival did not depend on one person appearing invulnerable. It depended on trust, preparation, sacrifice, and the courage to share duty before duty became destruction. Charles's greatest victory was not maintaining control at all costs. It was recognizing when love and wisdom required him to place that control in the hands of those he had prepared to continue his work. As William left his father resting peacefully, the monarchy entered its next chapter with sorrow in its heart and stability in its hands. True sovereignty was not proven by refusing to let go, but by knowing exactly whom to trust when the moment came.